The desert heat shimmered across the Naval Special Warfare Command range in waves so thick they distorted the target stand 3,800 meters downrange. Commander Nora Brennan stood in the shadow of the supply depot, clipboard pressed against her uniform, watching 9 of the most elite operators in the United States military fail for the 9th consecutive time. Lieutenant Derek Callahan slammed his fist against the shooting platform, the sound cracking across the otherwise silent range. His spotter, a broad-shouldered operator named Hayes, remained perfectly still behind the spotting scope, but Nora could see the tension in his shoulders even from 200 meters away. The rest of SEAL Team 6 stood in a loose cluster behind the firing line, their postures radiating the particular frustration that came from excellence meeting unexpected limitation. Nora adjusted the manifest papers on her clipboard, careful to maintain the appearance of someone merely present to verify equipment delivery. The Barrett M82A1 rifles had arrived on schedule, each one meticulously maintained according to specifications she had personally reviewed. The match-grade ammunition came from the batch she had traced through 3 separate quality control inspections. The spotting scopes, the ballistic computers, the weather monitoring equipment, all of it had passed through her logistics office with the kind of attention to detail that had earned her a reputation for absolute reliability. But she knew, watching Callahan reset his position behind the rifle, that equipment was not their problem. The wind shifted, a subtle change that Nora felt against her face before the anemometer readings updated on the range display board. 17 knots from the southwest, gusting to 22. Temperature at 94 degrees, humidity at 12%. Elevation difference of 270 feet between the firing position and target. Every number visible to anyone who cared to look, but numbers alone never told the complete story. Callahan fired. The report echoed across the range, and Nora watched the vapor trail, tracking its arc with eyes that had long ago learned to see what others missed. The round impacted 8 inches left and 4 inches low. Close, but in precision shooting at extreme range. Close meant failure. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you are watching from. Maybe you have witnessed similar moments where someone surprised everyone with unexpected expertise. Master Chief Franklin Webb emerged from the range control building, his weathered face creased with 30 years of experience that showed in every measured step. He approached the firing line with the deliberate pace of someone who had seen countless shooters struggle with this particular challenge. Nora had reviewed his service record when processing the range maintenance requests. 3 decades of training snipers, 2 combat deployments, and a reputation for brutal honesty that made him respected rather than liked. Webb stopped beside Callahan, studying the target display on the monitor that showed the impact point. He said something Nora could not hear from her distance, but she saw Callahan's shoulders tense further. The lieutenant turned, gesturing toward the rifle, then the ammunition, then the environmental monitoring station, blaming everything except the calculation error that Nora had identified on the 6th attempt. Chief Warrant Officer Ramon Torres separated from the group of observers, walking toward Webb and Callahan with the measured confidence of a team leader who maintained authority through competence rather than volume. Torres had the kind of presence that changed the energy of any space he entered. Where Callahan radiated aggressive intensity, Torres projected calm capability. Nora appreciated the difference, even as she maintained her position of careful observation. The 3 men conferred, Torres listening while Webb explained something with hand gestures that mimicked wind drift and bullet trajectory. Callahan interrupted twice, his body language defensive. Torres placed one hand on Callahan's shoulder, a gesture that looked casual but carried the weight of command authority. The lieutenant subsided, but the frustration remained visible in every line of his posture. Nora glanced down at her clipboard, reviewing the equipment manifest with practiced efficiency. Every item accounted for, every specification met, every maintenance log complete. Her logistics office ran with the kind of precision that most people associated with combat operations rather than supply chain management. 15 years of managing equipment, personnel rotations, and material distribution across 3 continents had taught her that excellence in support created the foundation for excellence in execution. But it also taught her that some skills, once learned, never completely faded. Torres turned away from the firing line, scanning the range area until his gaze settled on Nora. He raised one hand in a casual wave, then started walking in her direction. Nora maintained her position, professional and patient, giving no indication that her presence was anything other than routine logistics oversight. He covered the distance with the easy stride of someone completely comfortable in his own capability, stopping just close enough for conversation without crowding her space. Up close, she could see the laugh lines around his eyes, the kind that came from years of maintaining morale in high-stress situations. His uniform was immaculate despite the desert heat, and his handshake, when he offered it, was firm without being performative. Torres introduced himself, though Nora had known his name before he arrived on base. She made it her business to know everyone who requisitioned equipment through her department. He explained the training scenario, the mission parameters that required successful engagement at 3,800 meters within 72 hours. A high-value target simulation, preparing for operations in terrain where extreme-range precision could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Nora listened to Torres explain the mission parameters with the careful attention she brought to every briefing, nodding at appropriate intervals while her mind processed information on multiple levels. The high-value target scenario involved eliminating a threat in mountainous terrain where conventional approach was impossible. The shot distance of 3,800 meters represented the outer edge of current military capability, the kind of engagement that separated competent snipers from true masters of the craft. Torres gestured back toward the firing line where Callahan had stepped away from the rifle, pacing in tight circles that broadcast his frustration to anyone watching. The chief warrant officer's tone remained neutral as he mentioned the 9 failed attempts, framing them as learning opportunities rather than failures. Nora recognized the leadership approach, the way Torres maintained team morale even while acknowledging the severity of their current challenge. She asked about the ammunition specifications, a logistics question that fit her role perfectly while allowing her to probe deeper into their methodology. Torres pulled out a small notebook, rattling off grain weights, ballistic coefficients, and powder charges with the fluency of someone who understood that precision began with proper equipment selection. The numbers matched what Nora had verified during the delivery inspection, confirming that ammunition quality was not contributing to their mispattern. The wind gusted again, stronger this time, kicking up small dust devils that danced across the range before dissipating in the superheated air. Nora tracked the wind's movement automatically, noting how it channeled through the small ridge line 800 meters downrange, creating turbulence that the anemometer readings at the firing position could not fully capture. She had spent enough time studying this particular range to understand its quirks, the way local terrain features created microenvironments that defied simple mathematical modeling. Torres asked if she had noticed any equipment issues during her observation, the question casual but carrying genuine interest. Nora chose her words carefully, acknowledging that all equipment appeared to be functioning within specifications. She mentioned the environmental monitoring systems were providing accurate data, the rifles were properly maintained, and the ammunition batch had passed rigorous quality control. Everything, she said, looked correct on paper. The chief warrant officer studied her face for a moment, and Nora recognized the assessment happening behind his eyes. Torres had not achieved his position without developing the ability to read people, to sense when someone was offering partial truth rather than complete disclosure. She maintained steady eye contact, professional and helpful, giving him nothing to challenge while also not volunteering information beyond her stated role. A voice called out from the firing line, Hayes requesting Torres return for another attempt. The chief warrant officer excused himself, thanking Nora for her time and the efficiency of her logistic support. He turned back toward his team, but paused after 3 steps, looking over his shoulder with an expression that suggested he wanted to ask another question. Instead, he simply nodded and continued walking. Nora returned her attention to her clipboard, making notations that had nothing to do with equipment verification and everything to do with the pattern she had observed in 9 consecutive shot attempts. The missed distribution showed consistency in one direction, suggesting systematic error rather than random variation. Callahan was calculating wind drift correctly for the firing position, but failing to account for the wind shadow created by the ridge line at 800 meters and the subsequent turbulence that affected bullet flight in the final third of its trajectory. She had identified the error on the 6th shot, confirmed it on the 7th and 8th, and watched Callahan make the exact same mistake on the 9th attempt. The mathematics were complex, requiring understanding of fluid dynamics and terrain interaction that went beyond standard ballistic calculations. Most military snipers never encountered shooting problems this sophisticated because most military snipers never attempted shots this extreme. But Nora had encountered them years ago in places she no longer discussed, making shots that remained classified in files that few people had clearance to review. A golf cart approached from the direction of the main compound, driven by Lieutenant Junior Grade Beth Kimura, the youngest officer in Nora's logistics section. Beth navigated around the parked vehicles with careful precision, pulling up beside Nora with a smile that radiated the enthusiasm of someone who loved her job. She carried a tablet displaying updated inventory reports and a message that Admiral Patricia Vance requested Nora's presence in the command building. Nora acknowledged the message, glancing back toward the firing line where Callahan had resumed his position behind the Barrett. Torres stood beside him, binoculars raised, watching the target through heat shimmer that made accurate spotting nearly impossible at this distance. Webb had moved to the environmental monitoring station, checking readings with the methodical thoroughness of someone who trusted technology but verified everything personally. Beth asked if Nora wanted her to deliver the afternoon logistics reports to the SEAL team, an offer made with genuine eagerness to interact with special operations personnel. Nora smiled, recognizing her younger self in Beth's enthusiasm, and declined gently. Some interactions required the experience that came only from years of watching people, understanding unspoken dynamics, and knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. The 10th shot echoed across the range as Nora climbed into the passenger seat of the golf cart. She did not need to watch the impact to know it would miss. Callahan was talented, possibly even exceptional by conventional standards, but he was attempting something that required more than talent. It required the kind of understanding that came from making mistakes at extreme range, learning from them, and developing intuition that transcended mathematical formulas. Beth drove toward the command building, chattering about the SEAL team's reputation and her excitement at having them train on base. Nora listened with half her attention, the other half still calculating wind patterns, barrel harmonics, and the precise moment when she would be forced to step out of the comfortable anonymity of her logistics role. Admiral Vance had summoned her for a reason, and Nora suspected she knew exactly what that reason was. Admiral Patricia Vance stood at the window of her office, hands clasped behind her back, watching the range through binoculars that cost more than most sailors earned in a month. She did not turn when Nora entered, simply gestured toward the chair facing her desk while continuing her observation. The office reflected 3 decades of naval service, walls decorated with commendations and photographs that traced a career from junior officer to flag rank. Nora remained standing, waiting for the admiral to complete whatever assessment she was conducting. Through the window, she could see the firing line as a distant strip of concrete shimmering in the heat, tiny figures moving with the careful deliberation of professionals attempting something that kept defeating them. The admiral finally lowered the binoculars and turned, her expression revealing nothing. Patricia Vance had earned her stars through a combination of brilliant strategic thinking and the political acumen necessary to navigate flag officer politics without compromising her principles. She was shorter than Nora by 3 inches, but presence had nothing to do with physical stature. When the admiral sat behind her desk, The weight of command settled over the room like a physical force. She asked Nora for her assessment of the SEAL team's equipment, a question that could be answered in 30 seconds, but was clearly intended to open a longer conversation. Nora provided a concise summary, confirming that every item met or exceeded specifications. The rifles were properly zeroed, the ammunition was match-grade consistency, and the environmental monitoring equipment was functioning correctly. From a logistics perspective, she explained there were no deficiencies to address. The Admiral nodded slowly, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. She mentioned that the SEAL team had 48 hours remaining to accomplish their training objective, and that failure would result in mission reassignment that could compromise national security operations. The stakes, she said with careful emphasis, extended beyond training pride into operational necessity. Nora waited, recognizing the pause as deliberate. Admiral Vance did not waste time on conversations that lacked purpose, and this meeting clearly had a specific destination that had not yet been revealed. The silence stretched between them, comfortable for Nora, but weighted with expectation. The Admiral asked if Nora had observed the shooting attempts. A simple question with complicated implications, because observing and understanding were vastly different activities. Nora confirmed that she had watched from the supply depot area, maintaining her logistics oversight responsibilities while the SEAL team conducted their training. Admiral Vance leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking softly. She asked if Nora had noticed anything that might explain the consistent mispattern. Another question that could be answered simply but invited complexity. Nora considered her response carefully, aware that the conversation had reached its critical junction. She explained that the mispattern showed systematic rather than random distribution, suggesting calculation methodology rather than equipment malfunction. The terrain features downrange, she noted, created wind conditions that were not fully captured by the firing position monitoring equipment. The ridgeline, at 800 meters, produced turbulence effects that required experiential understanding rather than mathematical modeling. The Admiral's expression did not change, but something shifted in her eyes. She asked how someone in logistics would recognize such sophisticated ballistic considerations. The question was not accusatory, simply direct in the way that flag officers could be when they already knew the answer and wanted to hear it spoken aloud. Nora maintained her professional composure, acknowledging that her previous assignment had included range management responsibilities that exposed her to advanced shooting concepts. A careful truth that revealed nothing classified while explaining her technical knowledge. The Admiral studied her face for several seconds, then opened a desk drawer and removed a file folder. The folder was thin, marked with classification headers that made its contents inaccessible to 99% of military personnel. Admiral Vance did not open it, simply placed it on the desk between them like a chess piece moved into significant position. She mentioned that certain operational records remained sealed for national security reasons, but that flag officers with appropriate clearances could access summary information when operationally necessary. Nora recognized her old service record, the one that documented 3 years she rarely discussed and had spent 12 years trying to distance herself from through exemplary logistics performance. The folder represented a past that she had deliberately left behind, not from shame, but from a desire to build a career on different foundations. The Admiral asked if Nora believed the SEAL team could achieve their training objective within the remaining time frame. A question that seemed straightforward, but carried implications that extended into orders and expectations. Nora chose her words with surgical precision, stating that success would require either experiential learning that typically took months to develop or guidance from someone who had already mastered the specific challenges of extreme-range shooting in complex terrain. Admiral Vance nodded as if Nora had confirmed something she already suspected. She mentioned that the SEAL team's training objective directly supported an operational requirement that could not be delayed for extended training cycles. Lives, she said with quiet emphasis, depended on capability being available when needed rather than when convenient. The Admiral stood, walking back to the window where the distant firing line was barely visible through the afternoon heat shimmer. She stated that while she understood Nora's preference for her current career path, operational necessity sometimes required personnel to utilize capabilities regardless of personal preferences. Not an order yet, but the prelude to one. Nora asked what specifically the Admiral was requesting, maintaining the formality that rank structure demanded even while both of them understood the conversation's direction. Admiral Vance turned from the window, her expression carrying the weight of command decisions that balanced individual desires against operational requirements. She requested that Nora provide technical consultation to the SEAL team regarding extreme-range shooting in complex terrain environments. A carefully phrased request that could be interpreted as simple advisory support, but clearly meant something more substantial. The Admiral added that Chief Warrant Officer Torres had already expressed interest in any technical expertise that might accelerate their capability development. Nora considered the request, weighing her carefully maintained professional boundaries against the operational necessity that the Admiral had outlined. 15 years of logistics work had built a reputation she valued, a career identity separate from skills she had deliberately set aside. But she had also sworn an oath that placed mission success above personal preference. Nora agreed to provide technical consultation, the words leaving her mouth with a finality that felt like stepping across a threshold she had spent years avoiding. Admiral Vance nodded once, crisp and efficient, then dismissed her with instructions to coordinate directly with Chief Warrant Officer Torres. The meeting had lasted less than 15 minutes, but had fundamentally altered Nora's carefully maintained professional boundaries. The walk back to the range felt longer than the actual distance, each step carrying Nora closer to a role she had deliberately abandoned 12 years ago. The desert sun beat down with relentless intensity, and she found herself automatically checking wind conditions, noting the way heat shimmer affected visibility, cataloging terrain features that would influence long-range ballistics. Old habits reasserting themselves with disturbing ease. Beth waited beside the golf cart, scrolling through her tablet with the focused attention of someone who took even routine tasks seriously. She looked up as Nora approached, her expression curious but professional enough not to ask about the Admiral's summons. Nora appreciated the discretion, settling into the passenger seat while organizing her thoughts about how to approach the SEAL team without revealing more than operationally necessary. The 11th shot echoed across the range as they drove back toward the firing line. Nora did not need to see the impact to know it had missed. The sound carried information if you knew how to listen, the crack of the round breaking the sound barrier, the way it cut through air that was too hot and too thin for optimal ballistic performance. Callahan was fighting the environment instead of working with it, applying brute force mathematics to a problem that required subtle understanding. Torres stood apart from the main group when Nora arrived, speaking quietly with Master Chief Webb. Both men turned as she approached, their body language shifting from private conversation to professional courtesy. Torres thanked her for coming, his tone suggesting the Admiral had already briefed him on Nora's expanded role. Webb studied her with the assessing gaze of someone who had trained thousands of shooters and could recognize capability even when carefully hidden. Nora asked to review their ballistic calculations, a technical request that fit within her consultation parameters. Torres handed over a tablet displaying wind speed, temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, and the mathematical formulas they were using to calculate bullet drop and wind drift. The numbers were correct for standard extreme-range engagement, but they failed to account for the terrain-induced complications that made this particular shot uniquely challenging. She pointed to the ridge line at 800 meters, asking if they had considered how it affected wind patterns downrange. Torres admitted they had noted the terrain feature, but had not calculated specific effects beyond what the anemometer reading suggested. Webb interjected that in his 30 years of range experience, terrain-induced turbulence remained one of the most difficult variables to quantify. Nora explained that the ridge line created a wind shadow immediately behind it, followed by turbulent mixing where the disrupted air mass collided with the prevailing wind. The effect extended roughly 3 times the height of the ridge, creating a zone where bullet flight became unpredictable using standard calculations. The mathematical modeling required understanding fluid dynamics at a level beyond typical military sniper training. Callahan had been listening from his position at the firing line, and he turned now with barely concealed skepticism. He asked how a logistics officer knew about advanced ballistic fluid dynamics, the question carrying an edge that suggested he doubted her expertise. Nora met his gaze steadily, responding that range management in her previous assignment had required understanding these concepts to properly design training scenarios. The lieutenant challenged her, asking if understanding theory translated into practical shooting ability. His tone carried the particular arrogance of someone accustomed to being the most skilled person in any room, now confronted with someone who might know more than he did. Torres stepped forward, his presence a subtle reminder of team hierarchy, but Nora raised one hand slightly to indicate she would handle the situation herself. She acknowledged that theory and practice were different domains, but noted that successful extreme-range shooting required both. The mathematics provided a starting point, but experience taught the adjustments that no formula could capture. Callahan asked if she had that experience, the question almost a dare. Nora simply stated that she had fired enough rounds at extreme range to understand the difference between calculated solutions and practical results. Webb asked a technical question about how to adjust for the turbulence zone, his interest genuine rather than challenging. Nora described a technique that involved aiming for the wind condition at the target rather than averaging the wind along the bullet's entire path. The approach required trusting counterintuitive calculations because the numbers often suggested aiming in directions that felt wrong based on firing position wind. Torres listened with the focus of a leader recognizing valuable information, occasionally asking clarification questions that demonstrated his tactical intelligence. He mentioned they had 36 hours remaining before the training window closed, and asked if Nora's consultation could provide practical guidance beyond theoretical understanding. She confirmed that she could walk them through the calculation methodology, though warned that implementing it successfully would require trust in numbers that contradicted their current approach. Callahan made a dismissive sound, barely audible but clearly intentional. He stated that SEAL Team 6 operators did not need basic instruction from support personnel, regardless of what theoretical knowledge they possessed. His team had successfully completed dozens of extreme-range engagements in actual combat, he added, suggesting that credentials mattered more than academic understanding. Nora remained calm, acknowledging his experience while noting that this particular shooting problem exceeded typical combat engagement parameters. The 3,800-meter distance combined with complex terrain placed it at the outer edge of human capability, requiring specialized knowledge that even elite operators might not have encountered. Callahan responded that they would figure it out through repetition, the same way they solved every other tactical problem. Torres intervened, stating that operational timelines did not permit trial and error learning. They needed capability now, he emphasized, and pride was a luxury they could not afford when mission success was at stake. Callahan subsided, but his body language remained resistant, the tension between accepting help and maintaining ego playing out in the set of his shoulders. The afternoon sun had shifted westward by the time Nora finished explaining the revised calculation methodology. Torres and Webb absorbed the information with the focused attention of professionals recognizing expertise, asking questions that demonstrated understanding rather than skepticism. Callahan maintained his position at the firing line, ostensibly checking his rifle, but clearly listening to every word while refusing to acknowledge the value of what he was hearing. Nora walked them through the fluid dynamics calculations, using the tablet to show how air masses interacted with terrain features. She explained that the ridgeline created a pressure differential, low pressure immediately behind it, where air moved faster to fill the void, then chaotic mixing, where that accelerated air collided with the prevailing wind pattern. The bullet spent roughly 2 seconds in that turbulent zone, enough time for unpredictable forces to push it off course by margins that meant the difference between hit and miss. Webb asked how she had learned these calculations, a question delivered with genuine curiosity rather than challenge. Nora provided the same carefully constructed answer about range management responsibilities, adding that extreme-range shooting attracted people who enjoyed solving complex problems. The Master Chief nodded, accepting the explanation while his eyes suggested he suspected there was more to the story. Torres requested a practical demonstration of the calculation method, wanting to see theory translated into shot preparation. Nora agreed, asking for access to the ballistic computer and environmental monitoring data. Callahan finally turned from the firing line, stating that they had already input every relevant variable and the computer had provided solutions that had failed 11 times. His frustration was becoming less controlled, bleeding through the professional veneer that special operations demanded. Nora acknowledged the computer's limitations, explaining that commercial ballistic software was designed for standard conditions and could not account for terrain-specific complications without custom programming. The solution, she said, required manual calculation using principles that most ballistic software never considered. Callahan asked why they should trust calculations that contradicted proven computer models, his tone suggesting the question was rhetorical. She responded calmly that the computer models were proven for scenarios they were designed to handle, but this shot exceeded those parameters. The 3,800-meter distance in terrain with significant wind disruption required methodology that only a handful of military snipers had ever successfully employed. Callahan asked if she was claiming to be one of those handful, the challenge now explicit rather than implied. Torres cut through the tension with command authority that brooked no argument. He stated that they would attempt one shot using Nora's calculations, and if it showed improvement over their previous attempts, they would fully commit to her methodology. Callahan could either participate constructively or remove himself from the firing line. The lieutenant's jaw tightened, but he nodded acceptance, unwilling to undermine his team leader even while disagreeing with the approach. Nora took the tablet and began working through calculations that felt like muscle memory returning after years of disuse. She noted current wind speed at the firing position, then estimated conditions at the 800-meter ridge line based on terrain features and atmosphere pressure. The mixing zone required assumptions based on experience rather than measurement, educated guesses informed by hundreds of previous shots in similar conditions. The target zone wind was the critical variable, and Nora spent several minutes calculating what conditions would exist 3,800 meters downrange. She factored in the Coriolis effect, the Earth's rotation influencing bullet flight over distances where most people never considered such effects mattered. She calculated spin drift, the rightward push caused by the bullet's clockwise rotation as it traveled. Each variable added complexity to mathematics that already exceeded what most people considered reasonable for pulling a trigger. The final numbers contradicted the computer model by significant margins. Where the ballistic software suggested aiming 14 inches right and 32 inches high, Nora's calculations indicated aiming 26 inches right and 20 inches high. The difference was substantial enough that following her numbers meant trusting completely in methodology that could not be verified without taking the actual shot. Webb reviewed her calculations with careful attention, his weathered fingers tracing through the mathematical steps. He asked two technical questions about her assumptions in the turbulent mixing zone, and Nora explained her reasoning with the confidence that came from having made those exact calculations dozens of times in situations where missing meant mission failure. The Master Chief nodded slowly, then looked at Torres and stated that the mathematics were sound even if unconventional. Torres asked Callahan if he was willing to attempt a shot using these specifications. The lieutenant stared at the tablet display for long seconds, his internal conflict visible in the tightness around his eyes. He finally agreed, but added that when this attempt also failed, they would return to proven methods and solve the problem through shooter skill rather than experimental calculations. Nora said nothing, stepping back to give Callahan space to prepare. She had provided the solution, And now the execution belonged to someone who doubted both the methodology and the person providing it. The irony was not lost on her that success might prove more complicated than failure. If Callahan missed using her calculations, he would dismiss her consultation entirely. But if he succeeded, he would have to acknowledge that a logistics officer understood extreme-range shooting better than SEAL Team 6. The lieutenant settled behind the Barrett, his movements economical and practiced. Hayes positioned himself at the spotting scope, ready to call the shot impact. The rest of the team gathered at a respectful distance, their attention focused on what would be the 12th attempt at a target that had defeated them all afternoon. Torres stood beside Nora, his presence suggesting both support for her methodology and recognition that this shot would determine whether her consultation continued or ended. Callahan went through his breathing cycle, the slow, controlled respiration that lowered heart rate and steadied the body. His finger moved to the trigger, applying pressure with a gradual increase that separated precision shooting from rushed attempts. The seconds stretched, tension building in the silence that preceded every long-range shot. Then the Barrett fired, its report cracking across the range with authority that demanded attention. The bullet's vapor trail cut through the superheated air, visible for the first second of flight before dissipating into the heat shimmer. Hayes tracked it through the spotting scope, his body absolutely still as he followed the trajectory across 3,800 meters of desert terrain. Nora watched without needing optical enhancement, her eyes following the path from memory of countless similar shots, knowing the flight time would be roughly 4 seconds before impact. The silence stretched as everyone waited for Hayes to call the shot. Through the spotting scope at this distance, even with heat shimmer, the impact should be visible if the round struck anywhere near the target. Nora counted the seconds internally, her breathing steady while tension radiated from the SEAL team members surrounding her. For seconds passed, then 5. Hayes remained motionless behind the scope. Callahan finally asked for the call, his voice tight with controlled frustration. Hayes responded that he had impact, but needed a moment to verify placement through the heat distortion. More seconds passed while the spotter confirmed what he was seeing, cross-referencing with the digital target display that would show precise hit location. Then Hayes straightened slowly from the scope, turning to look at Callahan with an expression that mixed surprise with reluctant respect. He called the hit at 2 inches right and 1 inch high. Center mass on a target the size of a human torso, a killing shot at a distance where most military snipers never attempted engagement. The 12th attempt had succeeded where 11 had failed, using calculations that contradicted proven computer models and came from a logistics officer who spent her days managing supply chains rather than pulling triggers. The SEAL team erupted in celebration, voices raised in the particular joy that came from breaking through a barrier that had seemed insurmountable. Torres clapped Callahan on the shoulder, congratulating him on the shot while his eyes moved to Nora with acknowledgement that the success belonged to her methodology. Webb walked to the spotting scope to verify the impact himself, his professional thoroughness demanding personal confirmation even when he trusted his spotter completely. Callahan stood from the firing position, his face carrying conflicting emotions. Pride in making the shot competed with awareness that he had not solved the problem himself. He looked at Nora with an expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite resentment, something between the two that suggested internal recalibration of assumptions. He acknowledged that her calculations had been accurate, the words delivered with formal correctness rather than warmth. Torres asked if Nora could provide the same calculation support for multiple shot attempts, building consistent capability rather than single success. She confirmed that the methodology could be applied repeatedly, though noted that changing environmental conditions would require recalculation for each attempt. The chief warrant officer nodded, then stated that he wanted the entire team trained in her approach so they could function independently once the current training evolution concluded. Nora hesitated, recognizing that comprehensive training would require revealing more expertise than she had intended to display. Teaching the calculation methodology meant demonstrating depth of knowledge that went beyond consulting crossing from helpful support into territory that invited questions about how a logistics officer possessed such specialized skills. Torres noticed her pause, his perceptive gaze recognizing reluctance even while his command authority expected cooperation. She agreed to provide training, choosing mission success over personal preference in the way that military service demanded. Torres thanked her with genuine appreciation, then began organizing his team for additional shot attempts while conditions remained favorable. Callahan returned to the firing line with renewed focus, the sting of needing help beginning to fade as tactical pragmatism reasserted itself. Webb approached Nora while the SEAL team prepared for their 13th attempt, his weathered face thoughtful. He mentioned that in 30 years of training snipers, he had encountered perhaps a dozen people who truly understood extreme-range ballistics at the level she had just demonstrated. Most of them, he added with careful emphasis, were not logistics officers. The statement hung between them, not quite a question, but clearly an invitation to provide context. Nora acknowledged that her background included experiences beyond typical logistics training, keeping her response vague while respecting Webb's intelligence enough not to insult him with obvious evasion. The Master Chief nodded slowly, accepting the non-answer while his eyes suggested he would eventually learn the full story. He mentioned that Admiral Vance had exceptional judgment about personnel capabilities, a comment that seemed tangential but clearly connected to the current situation. The 13th shot cracked across the range, and Hayes called another hit, this time 3 inches left and 2 inches high. Still well within combat effectiveness, confirming that Nora's methodology was not lucky coincidence, but repeatable technique. The SEAL team's energy shifted from relief at breaking through to confidence that they had found their solution. Callahan looked toward Nora, and this time his nod carried more genuine respect than grudging acknowledgement. Beth appeared at the edge of the range, driving the golf cart with her usual careful attention to protocol. She waved to get Nora's attention, then pointed to her tablet indicating that logistics matters required attention. Nora excused herself from the range, grateful for the interruption that allowed temporary escape from scrutiny that would only intensify as the SEAL team's success continued. The ride back to the logistics office provided time to process the afternoon's developments. She had maintained her boundaries by providing technical consultation rather than demonstrating personal shooting ability, keeping her past at arm's length while still meeting operational requirements. But Torres was perceptive and Webb was experienced, and the line between consulting and revealing deeper expertise was thinner than she had hoped. Beth asked if the SEAL team had figured out their shooting problem, her tone carrying the enthusiasm of someone who loved hearing about tactical successes. Nora confirmed they had made progress, attributing it to refined calculation methodology rather than any single person's contribution. The younger officer pressed for details, wanted to understand the technical solutions, and Nora found herself explaining terrain-induced turbulence with more depth than she had intended. The conversation revealed how naturally the knowledge flowed, how easily she slipped into discussing concepts that most people found incomprehensibly complex. Beth absorbed the information with quick intelligence, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated she understood the principles even if she lacked experience applying them. Nora recognized her own younger self in that eager curiosity, the desire to understand everything about topics that captured imagination. They reached the logistics office as the 14th shot echoed across the base, too distant to hear the impact, but close enough that Nora automatically calculated flight time and probable result. Beth parked the golf cart and gathered her tablet, chattering about how impressive it was that Nora could help elite operators solve problems they could not crack themselves. The comment was innocent, admiring rather than probing, but it highlighted the exposure that came from demonstrating expertise. The logistics office provided sanctuary from the scrutiny that accompanied success. Nora spent the next 2 hours processing equipment requisitions and coordinating supply deliveries, immersing herself in the familiar rhythms of inventory management and procurement procedures. The work required attention, but not the hyper-focus of ballistic calculations, allowing her mind to partially relax while her hands completed tasks that had become automatic through years of practice. Beth worked at the adjacent desk, occasionally asking questions about requisition protocols or vendor selection criteria. The younger officer had the makings of an excellent logistics specialist, combining attention to detail with the interpersonal skills necessary to navigate military bureaucracy. Nora found herself mentoring naturally, sharing the accumulated wisdom that separated adequate performance from excellence in a field that most people dismissed as mundane. The sun had begun its descent toward the horizon when Torres appeared at the office door, still wearing his range gear and carrying the dust that came from hours in the desert. He knocked despite the door being open, waiting for Nora's acknowledgement before entering. Beth immediately straightened, her posture shifting to formal attention in the presence of special operations personnel. Torres smiled at her reaction, his demeanor putting her at ease while maintaining the professional distance that rank required. He asked if Nora had time to discuss the afternoon's training results, phrasing it as a request, though both of them understood that declining was not really an option. She invited him to sit, gesturing Beth to continue her work while they talked. Torres settled into the chair across from her desk, his movements carrying the controlled economy of someone who had spent years learning to conserve energy in demanding environments. The chief warrant officer reported that they had completed 6 successful shots using Nora's methodology, building confidence and consistency across multiple team members. Callahan had made 3 hits, Hayes had made 2, and their third sniper had succeeded on his first attempt using the revised calculations. The success rate had shifted from 0% to nearly 90% in a single afternoon, transforming mission capability from impossible to reliable. Torres expressed gratitude for her consultation, then transitioned to his actual purpose for visiting. He requested that Nora provide comprehensive training to his entire team, not just the shooters, but also the support personnel who would need to perform these calculations in operational environments. The training, he explained, would require approximately 8 hours spread across the next day and a half, fitting within their compressed timeline before deploying to conduct the actual mission. Nora began formulating a response about scheduling and logistics coordination, but Torres gently interrupted. He stated that Admiral Vance had already approved her temporary assignment to full-time training support, clearing her schedule of other responsibilities for the duration. The Admiral, he added with careful emphasis, had mentioned that Nora possessed unique qualifications that made her ideally suited for this specific training requirement. The statement carried implications that extended beyond technical knowledge. Admiral Vance was revealing Nora's background in incremental steps, each disclosure calculated to support operational requirements while respecting her preference for privacy. Torres was too intelligent not to recognize the pattern, his expression suggesting he understood there was more to Nora's expertise than range management experience. She agreed to provide the comprehensive training, accepting the inevitable exposure that came with the assignment. Torres thanked her, then asked if she would be willing to join them for dinner in the SEAL team mess facility. The invitation was social rather than professional, an extension of respect that went beyond her consultant role. Nora politely declined, citing logistics paperwork that required completion, though both of them recognized the excuse for what it was. Torres stood to leave, then paused at the door. He mentioned that Master Chief Webb had made an interesting observation about Nora's calculation methodology, noting similarities to techniques used by a Marine sniper team that had set records in Afghanistan during the early years of that conflict. The records remained classified, Torres said, but Webb remembered hearing about shots at distances that seemed impossible, made by shooters whose names were never officially acknowledged. Nora maintained her professional composure, stating that effective techniques often emerged independently in different units facing similar challenges. Torres nodded, accepting the deflection while his eyes suggested he was assembling pieces of a puzzle that would eventually form a complete picture. He thanked her again for her assistance and left, his footsteps fading down the corridor outside the office. Beth waited until Torres was definitely gone before erupting with questions. She wanted to know everything about the training Nora would provide, the technical details of extreme range shooting, and the classified records that Webb had mentioned. Her enthusiasm was genuine and infectious, reminding Nora of why she enjoyed mentoring younger officers who brought fresh energy to military service. Nora answered some questions while deflecting others, walking the line between educational mentoring and operational security. She explained the basic principles of terrain-induced turbulence and how fluid dynamics affected bullet flight, translating complex physics into accessible concepts. Beth absorbed the information eagerly, asking intelligent follow-up questions that demonstrated genuine comprehension rather than superficial interest. The conversation shifted when Beth asked how Nora had learned such advanced ballistic concepts. The question was innocent, driven by admiration rather than suspicion, but it highlighted the growing problem of maintaining her carefully constructed professional identity. Each person she helped, each question she answered, each technique she demonstrated pulled back another layer of the anonymity she had spent 12 years building. She provided the standard explanation about range management responsibilities and personal interest in precision shooting, adding details about ballistic software and online training resources to make the story more credible. Beth accepted the explanation, though something in her expression suggested the seeds of curiosity that would eventually grow into deeper questions. The younger officer was sharp enough to recognize when information did not quite fit expected patterns. Evening had settled over the base by the time Nora completed her paperwork and secured the office for the night. The walk to her quarters took her past the range, where work lights illuminated the firing line, suggesting the SEAL team was conducting night shooting exercises. She could hear the occasional crack of rifle fire, each report triggering automatic analysis of wind conditions, temperature effects, and the additional complications that darkness brought to extreme range engagement. Her quarters were modest, befitting a commander who preferred function over display. The space reflected 15 years of deliberate minimalism, walls bare of the photographs and memorabilia that most career officers accumulated. The only personal touch was a small bookshelf containing technical manuals on logistics management, supply chain optimization, and a single volume on advanced ballistics that she told herself she kept for reference rather than nostalgia. Nora changed out of her uniform and settled at the small desk, opening her laptop to review the training plan she would need to develop for the SEAL team. The work required structuring complex information into digestible segments, building from foundational concepts to advanced applications in a compressed time frame. She found herself falling into the rhythm of instructional design, organizing material with the same precision she brought to logistics coordination. But underlying the planning was awareness that tomorrow would require stepping further from the safety of her logistics identity into territory she had deliberately abandoned. Teaching meant demonstrating, and demonstration invited observation that would eventually reveal more than she wanted exposed. The training began at dawn, when the air was coolest and the wind patterns most predictable. Nora arrived at the range classroom 30 minutes early, setting up whiteboards with diagrams that illustrated terrain effects on bullet trajectory. The SEAL team filtered in gradually, some carrying coffee, all carrying the alert focus of professionals who recognized the value of what they were about to learn. Torres introduced Nora formally, establishing her authority to the team members who had not witnessed the previous day's breakthrough. He mentioned her technical expertise and the immediate capability improvement her methodology had produced, framing the training as tactical advantage rather than remedial instruction. The approach was deliberate, ensuring team buy-in by emphasizing operational benefits rather than acknowledging previous limitations. Callahan sat in the front row, his posture suggesting he had made peace with learning from someone outside special operations. The transformation from yesterday's skepticism to today's receptiveness demonstrated the pragmatism that kept elite operators alive. When capability was proven, ego became secondary to mission success. He had made 3 successful shots using Nora's calculations, and that empirical evidence outweighed any reluctance about the source of the knowledge. Nora began with foundational concepts, explaining how air behaved as a fluid and how terrain features disrupted flow patterns. She used civilian examples first, describing how buildings created wind shadows in cities, how mountains forced air masses to rise and create turbulence on the leeward side. The approach made complex physics accessible, building intuition before introducing mathematical formulas. The SEAL team engaged actively, asking questions that demonstrated both intelligence and tactical focus. They wanted to know how different terrain features affected airflow, how to recognize problematic geography from mission planning photographs, how to estimate turbulence intensity without sophisticated measuring equipment. Nora answered each question with practical examples, translating theory into actionable field techniques. Hayes asked about the ridgeline effect that had caused their previous failures, wanted to understand why the 800-meter terrain feature had such disproportionate impact on a bullet traveling 3,800 meters. Nora explained that the turbulent mixing zone extended roughly 3 times the ridge height, creating a 500-meter section where bullet flight became chaotic. The bullet spent only half a second in that zone, but at supersonic velocities, even brief disruption could deflect the projectile by inches. She drew diagrams showing air pressure differentials, velocity gradients, and the complex interaction between disrupted and undisrupted air masses. The SEAL team studied the illustrations with the focused attention of people whose lives would depend on understanding these concepts. Webb sat in the back row, occasionally nodding as Nora explained principles he had intuited through decades of experience, but never fully understood the underlying physics. The morning session transitioned from classroom to practical application at the firing line. Nora demonstrated the calculation methodology step by step, showing how to estimate wind conditions at various points along the bullet's path. She emphasized that precision mattered less than understanding which variables had the greatest impact. The ridgeline wind shadow was critical, while small variations in firing position wind were largely irrelevant at extreme range. Callahan volunteered to attempt the first shot using his own calculations, working through the methodology under Nora's supervision. She corrected his assumptions about the turbulent mixing zone, explaining that he was underestimating the effect because it contradicted his experiential baseline from shorter-range shooting. The lieutenant adjusted his numbers, though his expression suggested the revision felt wrong despite the mathematical logic. The shot hit 4 inches left and 3 inches high, inside the effective zone, but not the precision he had achieved yesterday using Nora's calculations. She reviewed his work, identifying where his turbulence estimation had been too conservative. Callahan tried again, adjusting his assumptions to match Nora's more aggressive turbulence model. The second shot struck 2 inches right and 1 inch low, near perfect placement that vindicated the counterintuitive calculations. Torres attempted the next shot, his first at this extreme range. He worked through the calculations methodically, checking each step against the framework Nora had taught. His numbers came out close to Callahan's revised attempt, suggesting he had internalized the core principles. The shot hit 3 inches right and 2 inches high, another success that built team confidence in the methodology. The training continued through the morning, each team member working through multiple calculation cycles and shot attempts. Nora moved between shooters, correcting assumptions and refining understanding. She found herself slipping into instructor mode naturally, the role feeling familiar despite 12 years away from it. The SEAL team responded well to her teaching style, appreciating clear explanations without condescension. Webb approached during a break, commenting that Nora taught like someone who had trained others extensively. The observation was casual but pointed, another piece of evidence accumulating toward conclusions she preferred to avoid. She deflected by mentioning that logistics training often involved instructing personnel on complex technical procedures, developing teaching skills through necessity. Webb accepted the explanation with a small smile that suggested he remained unconvinced. The afternoon session focused on environmental variations, teaching the team how to adjust calculations for different weather conditions, temperatures, and altitudes. Nora explained that the morning's cool air would be replaced by afternoon heat, that changed air density and therefore drag coefficients. The same shot that worked at dawn would miss by significant margins at 3 in the afternoon unless the calculations were adjusted. Callahan asked if she had experience shooting in various environmental conditions, the question probing rather than challenging. Nora confirmed that her background included exposure to different climates and altitudes, maintaining vagueness while acknowledging breadth of experience. The lieutenant nodded, filing away information that contributed to the growing understanding that her expertise was not theoretical. By late afternoon, every team member had successfully made multiple shots at 3,800 meters using the methodology Nora had taught. The transformation from yesterday's repeated failures to today's consistent success was dramatic enough that several team members mentioned it would fundamentally change how they approached extreme-range mission planning. Torres stated that he would be recommending Nora's techniques be incorporated into advanced SEAL sniper training curriculum. The suggestion made Nora uncomfortable, imagining her methodology spreading through special operations community and inevitably leading to questions about its origin. Torres noticed her hesitation, his perceptive gaze recognizing reluctance, even while his tactical mind valued the capability improvement. He assured her that any curriculum development would credit the techniques without necessarily identifying their source, offering professional protection she appreciated. As the training day concluded, Admiral Vance appeared at the range, observing the final shots from a distance that suggested she had been monitoring progress. She caught Nora's eye and gestured toward the command building, a subtle summons that indicated private conversation was needed. Nora excused herself from the SEAL team, walking toward whatever discussion the Admiral had planned. Admiral Vance waited in her office with the same thin classified folder from 2 days earlier, though this time it lay open on her desk. Nora entered and stood at attention until the Admiral gestured for her to sit, the formality between them maintained despite years of professional acquaintance. The setting sun cast long shadows through the window, painting the office in amber light that softened the hard edges of military efficiency. The Admiral began by acknowledging the training success, noting that Torres had reported complete capability transformation in less than 48 hours. The SEAL team would deploy tomorrow with confidence in extreme-range engagement that had been absent when they arrived. Nora accepted the compliment with professional modesty, attributing success to the team's tactical intelligence and willingness to embrace new methodology. Admiral Vance leaned forward, her expression shifting from professional approval to something more complex. She stated that Torres had asked specific questions about Nora's background, particularly regarding where she had acquired such specialized expertise. The Chief Warrant Officer was too experienced to accept vague explanations about range management, and his inquiries had become more direct as the training progressed. Nora had anticipated this conversation, though the reality of having it still carried weight. She acknowledged that her consultation had revealed more capability than her current role typically demonstrated. The Admiral nodded, then asked directly whether Nora was comfortable with Torres learning her complete background. The question was not rhetorical, but genuine, offering Nora agency in decisions about her own disclosure. She considered the implications carefully. Torres would eventually piece together the truth regardless, and controlled revelation was preferable to speculation. But allowing her past to become known meant accepting scrutiny and the inevitable questions about why someone with her capabilities had chosen logistics over operational roles. The protection of anonymity would be replaced by the burden of explanation. Admiral Vance mentioned that the operational mission the SEAL team would undertake involved eliminating a high-value target who was planning attacks against American diplomatic facilities. Intelligence indicated a single opportunity for engagement at extreme range in mountainous terrain. The shot parameters closely matched what they had trained for, though the actual distance would be 4,200 meters, 300 meters beyond their training scenario. The additional distance created complications that made success uncertain even with the methodology Nora had taught. The Admiral stated this plainly, without drama, simply acknowledging tactical reality. She then asked if Nora would be willing to accompany the SEAL team as technical advisor, providing real-time calculation support during the actual operation. Not as a shooter, she emphasized, but as the subject matter expert who could ensure the mission succeeded. Nora felt the careful boundaries she had maintained for 12 years crumbling under operational necessity. Deploying with a SEAL team meant returning to the world she had deliberately left, accepting roles she had spent years avoiding. But the Admiral had framed it clearly. Lives depended on mission success, and Nora's expertise represented the difference between capability and failure. She asked about the timeline and operational parameters, gathering information while her mind processed the implications. Admiral Vance explained that deployment would occur in 36 hours, allowing one additional day of training at the extended 4,200-meter distance. The mission duration would be approximately 72 hours, including infiltration, observation, engagement, and extraction. The Admiral added that Torres had specifically requested Nora's participation, stating that her presence would increase mission success probability from possible to probable. The Chief Warrant Officer understood that technical expertise in theater was more valuable than any amount of pre-mission training. Environmental conditions could change, terrain features might differ from satellite imagery, and having someone who could recalculate in real time would be operationally decisive. Nora recognized the inevitability of the situation even while resistance remained strong. She had built a career separate from the shooting that had defined her earlier service, establishing identity as a logistics professional rather than a sniper. Accepting this assignment meant acknowledging publicly what she had kept private, returning to a role she had thought permanently abandoned. Admiral Vance did not pressure, simply waited while Nora processed the decision. The silence stretched comfortably, two professional officers respecting the weight of choices that extended beyond immediate tactical considerations. Finally, Nora stated that she would deploy with the SEAL team as technical advisor, accepting the mission requirements despite personal reservations. The Admiral thanked her with genuine gratitude, then opened a desk drawer and removed a small wooden box. She explained that certain decorations remained classified for security reasons, particularly those awarded for operations that could not be publicly acknowledged. The box contained medals that Nora had earned during her 3 years as an operational sniper, decorations that had never appeared in her official record but existed in sealed files accessible only to flag officers with appropriate clearances. Admiral Vance stated that Nora's service during that period had been exemplary, involving operations in 7 countries under conditions that pushed human capability to absolute limits. Her shooting record included the longest confirmed kill in Marine Corps history at that time, a shot made under conditions that military analysts had deemed impossible. The transition to logistics had been honored as personal choice, but the Admiral wanted Nora to know that her operational contributions had not been forgotten by those with knowledge of such matters. Nora accepted the acknowledgement quietly, uncomfortable with recognition for actions she had spent years trying to contextualize as past rather than defining. The Admiral returned the metal box to her desk drawer, the gesture symbolic of secrets that remained officially unacknowledged even while privately honored. She mentioned that Torres would need to be briefed on Nora's operational background before deployment, establishing credibility and command structure for the mission. The Admiral asked if Nora preferred to provide that briefing herself or have it delivered through official channels. Nora chose to brief Torres directly, preferring to control the narrative rather than having her history summarized by others. Admiral Vance agreed, scheduling the briefing for later that evening after the SEAL team completed their final training session. As Nora stood to leave, the Admiral made one final comment. She stated that some people were called to operational roles despite preferring different paths, and that answering those calls represented the highest form of service. The observation was personal rather than professional, acknowledging the sacrifice inherent in accepting missions that disrupted carefully constructed lives. Nora returned to her quarters with several hours before the briefing with Torres, time that she spent preparing mentally for conversations she had avoided for more than a decade. The deployment represented not just tactical challenge, but personal reckoning, forcing her to integrate past and present in ways she had deliberately kept separate. The logistics officer and the sniper could no longer occupy different spaces in her identity. Tomorrow they would merge, for better or worse, in service of a mission that required both. Torres arrived at the briefing room precisely on time, carrying a notebook and the focused attention of someone who recognized that important information was about to be shared. Admiral Vance had set up the meeting in a secure facility, the kind of space where classified discussions occurred away from casual observation. Nora waited inside, having spent the previous hour organizing thoughts about how to present a past she rarely discussed. The chief warrant officer settled into a chair across the small table, his demeanor open and professional. He mentioned that Admiral Vance had indicated this briefing would provide context for Nora's expertise, and that understanding her background would be operationally relevant for the upcoming mission. Torres framed it as tactical preparation rather than personal curiosity, though Nora suspected both motivations were present. She began with basic timeline, explaining that before her logistics career, she had served as a Marine Corps Scout sniper for 3 years. The designation alone carried weight, as Marine Scout snipers were known for rigorous selection and training that produced some of the military's most capable long-range shooters. Torres nodded, his expression suggesting this confirmed suspicions he had already developed. Nora continued, describing deployment to Afghanistan during the period when extreme-range engagement was becoming tactically necessary due to terrain and enemy positioning. Her unit had operated in mountainous regions where conventional engagement distances were insufficient, requiring development of techniques that pushed beyond established doctrine. The work had been classified at the time, and remained so, involving operations that could not be publicly acknowledged. Torres asked about specific operations, and Nora provided what details she could within classification constraints. She mentioned working as part of a 2-person team, her and a spotter, conducting missions that lasted days in remote locations. The longest shot she had made was 4,800 meters, a distance that exceeded what most people considered possible with conventional rifles and ammunition. The target had been a high-value individual planning attacks against coalition forces, and the engagement had prevented significant American casualties. The chief warrant officer listened with the attention of someone who understood the complexity of what was being described. He asked about the 4,800-meter shot specifically, wanting to know terrain conditions, environmental factors, and how she had developed the calculation methodology. Nora explained that the technique had evolved through necessity, trial and error across dozens of attempts, gradually building intuition about how terrain affected bullet flight. She described the psychological challenge of trusting calculations that contradicted experiential baseline, the way extreme-range shooting required faith in mathematics that felt wrong. The mental discipline to follow the numbers despite instinct was often harder than the physical skill of trigger control and breath management. Torres commented that he had experienced exactly that difficulty during yesterday's training. The sensation of aiming in directions that seemed incorrect despite knowing the calculations were sound. Nora mentioned that after 3 years of operational shooting, she had requested transfer to logistics. The decision had been personal rather than performance-related, driven by desire to build career identity separate from the intensity of operational roles. The Marine Corps had honored her request, and she had spent the following 12 years deliberately distancing herself from her sniper background while building expertise in supply chain management. Torres asked why she had chosen such a complete separation, given that her shooting capabilities could have contributed to training and doctrine development. Nora explained that the operational work had taken psychological toll that she had needed distance from, and that logistics offered intellectual challenge without the weight of life-and-death decisions. Torres accepted the explanation without judgment, his experience sufficient to understand that combat roles affected people differently. The chief warrant officer then asked directly if Nora would be comfortable shooting on the upcoming mission if circumstances required. She hesitated, the question touching the core of her reluctance about deployment. Admiral Vance had framed her role as technical advisor, but operational realities often differed from planning assumptions. If the mission required her to pull the trigger, could she do it after 12 years away from that role? Nora stated honestly that she did not know. The physical skills remained, maintained through private practice that she had never completely abandoned. But the mental framework for making lethal decisions had been deliberately deconstructed, and she was uncertain whether it could be quickly rebuilt. Torres appreciated the honesty, noting that self-awareness about capability limitations was more valuable than false confidence. He mentioned that the mission planning assumed Callahan would be the primary shooter, with Hayes as spotter and Nora providing calculation support. However, operational flexibility required backup options, and knowing Nora's shooting background meant the team could adapt if circumstances demanded. She acknowledged this was reasonable tactical planning, even while hoping it would not become necessary. Torres shifted to practical mission details, explaining that the target was a weapons facilitator operating from a compound in mountainous terrain. Intelligence indicated he would be vulnerable for a 3-hour window during a scheduled meeting with subordinates. The engagement distance would be approximately 4,200 meters, with significant elevation difference and complex wind patterns created by valley topography. The chief warrant officer showed her satellite imagery of the target area, pointing out terrain features that would affect the shot. Nora studied the images with professional focus, identifying the ridge lines and valley configurations that would create turbulent air masses. The shooting position would be on a mountain slope overlooking the target compound, with clear line of sight, but wind patterns that made the engagement extremely challenging. She asked about backup positions in case primary location proved unsuitable, and Torres indicated they had identified 2 alternatives at different ranges and angles. The flexibility was good tactical planning, though Nora noted that each position would require separate calculation methodology due to different terrain interactions. Torres acknowledged this complexity, stating that mission success would depend heavily on Nora's ability to assess conditions and provide accurate guidance quickly. The briefing continued for another hour, covering logistics, insertion methods, communication protocols, and extraction planning. Torres asked technical questions about equipment preferences and environmental monitoring needs. Nora requested specific meteorological instruments and ballistic tools, building the technical foundation for mission success. As the briefing concluded, Torres thanked her for the candid background information. He mentioned that knowing her operational history gave him confidence in mission success probability, and that the SEAL team would trust her expertise completely. Nora appreciated the professional respect, even while feeling the weight of expectations that came with reputation. Torres paused at the door before leaving, turning back with an expression that mixed curiosity with respect. He stated that Master Chief Webb had guessed correctly about Nora being the Marine sniper from the classified Afghanistan operations. Webb had trained with Marines who mentioned a female scout sniper, setting records that seemed impossible, though her name had never been officially released. Torres added that Webb was honored to have worked with her, a comment that carried weight coming from someone with 30 years of experience. Nora accepted the acknowledgement quietly, uncomfortable with recognition, but understanding it was inevitable once her background became known. Torres left, and she remained in the briefing room for several minutes, processing the transition from anonymous logistics officer to acknowledged operational asset. Tomorrow would bring final training at the extended 4,200-meter distance, and the following day would bring deployment into the role she had spent 12 years avoiding. The final training day began before sunrise, the SEAL team gathering at the range while stars still populated the sky. They had extended the target distance to 4,200 meters overnight, placing steel silhouettes at the exact range they would encounter during the actual mission. The additional 400 meters created complications that made yesterday's successful shots seem almost easy by comparison. Nora arrived carrying her personal rifle case, a decision made after hours of internal debate. If she was deploying as technical advisor, maintaining the fiction of pure consultation no longer served any purpose. The team needed to see her shoot, to understand that her expertise came from practical application rather than theoretical study. Torres had not requested this demonstration, but Nora recognized its operational value. Callahan noticed the rifle case immediately, his expression shifting from curiosity to interest. The rest of the team gathered around as Nora opened the case, revealing a custom-built precision rifle that showed the wear of extensive use. The weapon was immaculately maintained, but carried the subtle marks of years in harsh environments, evidence of a tool used for serious work rather than recreational shooting. Webb approached to examine the rifle, his experienced eye cataloging modifications that indicated professional-level customization. He commented that this was a weapon built by someone who understood extreme range requirements intimately, noting the barrel specifications, the custom stock design, and the specialized optics mounting system. Nora confirmed that she had assembled the rifle during her operational years, maintaining it through her logistics career despite rarely firing it. Torres asked if she intended to demonstrate the 4,200-meter shot, the question carrying no pressure but obvious interest. Nora confirmed this was her plan, explaining that the team would benefit from seeing the complete process from calculation through execution. Callahan mentioned that none of them had yet succeeded at this extended distance, their morning attempts all missing by margins that suggested they were still refining the methodology. Nora began her preparation ritual, movements economical and practiced. She set up her equipment with the methodical precision of someone who had performed these actions hundreds of times in conditions where mistakes meant mission failure. The environmental monitoring instruments came out first, positioned to capture wind speed, temperature, humidity, and barometric pressure. She checked each reading twice, verifying accuracy before trusting the data. The ballistic calculation took 15 minutes, Nora working through mathematics that accounted for every variable she could measure and several she had to estimate. The 4,200-meter distance meant bullet flight time would exceed 5 seconds, an eternity in ballistic terms where small errors compounded into large misses. She calculated the Coriolis effect, the spin drift, the velocity decay across distance, and the complex wind interactions created by valley topography visible in the satellite imagery. The SEAL team watched in silence as she worked, observing a master craftsperson at the peak of her discipline. There was something almost meditative about Nora's focus, the way she shut out everything except the problem in front of her. Torres later mentioned that watching her prepare had reminded him why true expertise commanded respect regardless of current job title or organizational role. Nora settled behind her rifle, adjusting the position until her body alignment felt correct. She went through breathing cycles, slowing her heart rate to levels that most people achieved only in deep sleep. Her finger found the trigger, applying preliminary pressure while she studied the target through her scope. The steel silhouette was barely visible at 4,200 meters, a tiny shape that wavered in the heat shimmer despite the early hour. The wind shifted, a subtle change that Nora felt against her face before the instruments registered the variation. She recalculated quickly, adjusting her aim point by 2 inches to account for the new conditions. Hayes, watching through a spotting scope beside her, whispered that the target was clear in his optic. Nora acknowledged without speaking, her focus complete and absolute. The seconds stretched as she waited for the perfect moment, that brief window when wind was steady, her breathing was controlled, and every variable aligned as closely as possible. Then she squeezed the trigger with pressure so gradual that the rifle's discharge almost surprised her, the sign of proper trigger control, where the shot breaks without conscious decision to fire. The rifle's report cracked across the desert, and everyone tracked the vapor trail as the bullet arced toward its distant target. 5 seconds felt like an eternity, the SEAL team holding collective breath while they waited for impact. Then the distinctive clang of metal striking metal echoed faintly back across the distance, the sound delayed by the time required for acoustic waves to travel 4,200 meters. Hayes called the hit, his voice carrying excitement despite his professional control. Center mass, within 2 inches of perfect point of aim. The shot had not just succeeded, but had demonstrated the level of precision that separated competent extreme-range shooting from mastery. Callahan stood from his observation position, walking to where Nora remained behind her rifle, and extended his hand in acknowledgement of expertise that exceeded his own. The gesture meant more than words could express, a special operations professional recognizing capability without ego or resentment. Nora accepted the handshake, appreciating the respect while also feeling the weight of expectations that came with demonstration. She was no longer just the technical advisor, but the standard against which the team would measure their own performance. Torres requested that Nora walk Callahan through one attempt at the 4,200-meter distance, providing real-time guidance as she would during the actual mission. She agreed, positioning herself beside the SEAL sniper while he prepared his shot. The teaching relationship had shifted now that the team understood her operational background. Questions came faster and probed deeper, seeking to absorb as much knowledge as possible before deployment. Callahan worked through his calculations with Nora watching, catching 2 errors in his wind estimation and 1 mistake in his Coriolis correction. She explained each error patiently, helping him understand not just what was wrong, but why his intuition had led him astray. The lieutenant absorbed the feedback without defensiveness, his focus on improvement rather than ego protection. His shot hit 6 inches left and 4 inches high, within the combat effective zone, but not the precision Nora had demonstrated. She reviewed his execution, identifying a slight cant in his rifle that had introduced angular error. Callahan corrected the issue and attempted again, this time striking 3 inches right and 2 inches high. Progress, though both of them recognized he had not yet achieved the consistency required for mission-critical shooting. The morning continued with each team member attempting multiple shots at 4,200 meters, gradually building familiarity with the extended distance. Success rates improved from 0% at dawn to approximately 60% by midday. Significant progress, but still leaving 40% failure that could mean mission catastrophe if it occurred during the operational window. Torres pulled Nora aside during a break, discussing contingency planning for scenarios where Callahan could not make the shot. The chief warrant officer stated directly that if operational circumstances demanded, he needed to know whether Nora could execute. She had avoided answering this question definitively, but Torres required clarity for mission planning that balanced optimal outcomes with realistic backup options. Nora considered the question seriously, weighing her 12-year distance from lethal decision-making against operational necessity and her own capabilities. She finally stated that if mission success required her to shoot, she would do so, though preferred this remain contingency rather than primary plan. Torres accepted this commitment, noting it in his planning documents as operational flexibility that increased mission success probability. The mission insertion occurred under darkness, the SEAL team moving through mountainous terrain with practice silence. Nora carried her equipment alongside the operators, her conditioning maintained through years of physical training that she had never abandoned despite leaving operational roles. The 12-hour approach to the shooting position tested endurance and mental focus, each team member carrying equipment loads that would exhaust most people within hours. They reached the primary position 2 hours before dawn, establishing observation posts while Nora began environmental assessment. The valley below them held the target compound, barely visible in pre-dawn darkness. She set up her monitoring instruments, gathering data about wind patterns, temperature gradients, and atmospheric conditions that would affect the shot. The actual engagement distance measured 4,170 meters, slightly less than trained, but still at the extreme edge of capability. Torres established command position with communications equipment, linking them to Tactical Operations Center. Intelligence confirmed the target would be vulnerable during a 3-hour window beginning at 1000 hours, meeting with subordinates in a courtyard area that offered clear line of sight from their position. Everything depended on making one perfect shot during that narrow time frame. Callahan prepared his firing position as dawn illuminated the valley, revealing terrain features that match satellite imagery, but carried details that photographs could not capture. Nora studied the landscape with experienced eyes, identifying wind indicators in vegetation movement and dust patterns. The valley created complex air currents, morning thermals beginning to develop as the sun warmed the ground. She worked through preliminary calculations, building baseline data that would be refined as conditions evolved. Hayes occupied the spotter position beside Callahan, both men settling into the patient alertness that extreme range shooting required. The rest of the team maintained security perimeter, their attention focused outward while the shooting pair concentrated on the target area. The morning advanced slowly, tension building as they waited for the target to appear. Nora recalculated every 30 minutes, tracking how changing conditions affected ballistic solutions. Wind speed increased as the sun rose, adding complexity to already challenging mathematics. By 9:30, conditions had shifted enough that her original calculations were obsolete, requiring complete recalculation based on current environment. At 9:58, Torres received confirmation that the target had arrived at the compound. Movement in the courtyard indicated the meeting was beginning. Nora provided Callahan her final calculations, numbers that incorporated every variable she could measure and estimate. The lieutenant checked his rifle one final time, then settled into shooting position with focus that shut out everything except target and trigger. 3 minutes passed while Callahan waited for optimal conditions. Nora monitored wind indicators, watching for the moment when turbulence settled enough to attempt the shot. Then she noticed something that made her breath catch. The wind pattern had shifted from her last calculation, a change subtle enough that instruments had not yet fully registered, but visible in vegetation movement if you knew what to observe. She called a hold, informing Callahan that conditions had changed. The lieutenant came off his rifle, frustration evident despite professional control. Nora recalculated quickly, adjusting for the wind shift that had developed in the last 2 minutes. The new numbers differed significantly from her previous solution, aiming point moving by 8 inches to compensate for change conditions. Callahan questioned the revision, noting that instrument readings showed only minor variation from previous measurements. Nora explained that valley topography created microenvironments where localized conditions differed from general readings. The lieutenant had to trust her assessment based on observational indicators rather than digital measurements. Torres confirmed the call, his command authority backing Nora's judgment despite the uncertainty inherent in relying on visual wind reading. 10 minutes passed with the target exposed in the courtyard. Callahan resettled behind his rifle with the revised calculations, breathing controlled and finger on trigger. Nora watched wind indicators, waiting for the settling period that would allow the shot. But the conditions remained unstable, gusting and shifting in ways that made successful engagement improbable. Torres asked for a probability assessment, needing to know if they should attempt the shot or abort and seek another opportunity. Nora evaluated honestly, stating that current conditions gave Callahan approximately 40% success probability, better than zero, but far from assured. The chief warrant officer considered tactical options, weighing risks of failed attempt against risks of losing the target entirely if they did not engage. The decision crystallized when intelligence reported that the target was preparing to depart. The meeting was concluding early, reducing the engagement window from hours to minutes. Torres looked at Nora, the unspoken question clear. She had demonstrated capability far exceeding Callahan's at this distance. If anyone could make this shot in suboptimal conditions, it was her. Nora felt the moment's weight, 12 years of careful boundary maintenance collapsing under operational necessity. She moved to the rifle without speaking, Callahan yielding position with understanding that mission success outweighed personal pride. Hayes remained at the spotter scope, ready to call her shot. Torres watched from command position, trusting her judgment completely. She settled behind Callahan's rifle, adjusting stock and scope to match her preferences. The weapon was unfamiliar, different from her personal rifle in subtle ways that required quick adaptation. But fundamentals remained constant across all precision rifles, and her experience transcended specific equipment. She began her breathing cycle, slowing physiology to enable the steadiness that extreme range shooting demanded. The wind shifted again, and Nora recalculated in real time, adjusting aim point based on changing conditions. Through the scope, the target appeared as a barely distinguishable figure among several people in the courtyard. Hayes confirmed identification, his intelligence brief providing details that matched the individual in her crosshairs. This was the moment that justified the entire operation, one trigger squeeze that would prevent future attacks and save lives. Nora found the stillness between heartbeats, that microsecond when the human body achieves perfect motionlessness. Her finger increased pressure on the trigger with such gradual precision that the shot broke without conscious decision. The rifle fired, and she rode the recoil while tracking the vapor trail downrange. 5 seconds of flight time stretched into subjective eternity. Hayes called the hit, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what had just occurred. The target was down. Engagement successful at 4,170 meters under conditions that would have defeated most shooters on the planet. The SEAL team maintained operational discipline, beginning immediate extraction procedures rather than celebrating. But the tension that had defined the mission released, replaced by confidence in successful completion. The extraction took 8 hours, the team moving through terrain with alertness maintained despite fatigue. Nora carried her equipment alongside the operators, now fully integrated into the team rather than external consultant. Callahan spoke to her during a rest break, acknowledging that he had witnessed something remarkable and expressing appreciation for her willingness to execute when circumstances demanded. Torres provided after-action assessment during the flight home, praising team performance while noting that mission success had ultimately depended on expertise that transcended standard training. He stated that he would be recommending Nora for decoration appropriate to her contribution, though acknowledged that classification constraints might limit official recognition. She appreciated the intent, while noting that she had simply done what the mission required. Admiral Vance met them upon return to base, conducting private debrief with Nora in her office. The Admiral confirmed mission success and operational impact, then asked how Nora felt about returning to shooting after 12 years away. Nora responded honestly that the experience had been both familiar and foreign, capabilities intact, but context fundamentally changed from her earlier operational years. The Admiral mentioned that Nora's deployment had demonstrated that some skills persisted regardless of time away, and that expertise could be applied when circumstances warranted, even if personal preference was otherwise. She then stated that Nora was free to return to her logistics role without expectation of future operational assignments unless she chose otherwise. The choice was genuinely hers, no pressure or obligation beyond what she accepted for herself. Nora returned to her office the following day, resuming logistics responsibilities with the same precision she had always maintained. Beth greeted her enthusiastically, having heard rumors about the mission but lacking details. The younger officer asked if Nora had actually deployed with SEAL Team 6, the question carrying wonder rather than disbelief. Nora confirmed basic facts while maintaining operational security about specifics. If you enjoyed this story, drop a comment and let us know what moment resonated most with you, or share if you have ever discovered unexpected capabilities in someone you underestimated. Word of Nora's background spread through the base over following weeks, transforming her from anonymous logistics officer into recognized tactical asset. She handled the attention with professional grace, neither embracing nor rejecting recognition, but simply continuing her work with the competence that had always defined her service. The logistics role remained her primary identity, but now integrated rather than separated from capabilities she had spent years keeping private. The mission had forced reconciliation between past and present, creating wholeness from what had been deliberately fragmented.